Hey, my name is ShawNshawN. I sell art on ShawNshawN.co, and today we're going to review Judas and the Black Messiah. So this is a film by Shaka King. There's also 3 more writers, but I think it's her story plus the Lucas brothers. So there's a lot of different writers involved to kind of put this all together. Luckily, one of the writers is the director, so probably it was kind of her story, or maybe she's reinterpreting the story, I'm not sure, but it's good because it's kind of one of those historical films that you want to get right, so it's good to have quite a lot of different writers to get all the different pieces come together correctly, because you don't want to screw up a really nice historical piece. This is based on the Black Panthers, so you want to get that story right, you want to get MLK's story right, you want to get Malcolm X's story right. So all those stories, usually there's a lot of people come together, so that makes sense. Time is 2 hours 6 minutes. I think it's about adequate because it is a lot of different characters, so you need a lot of film play. So you're gonna need to go longer than the normal hour and a half that I kind of like for a normal film. But with the historical drama, you have more characters involved, and so you need to kind of build up those characters, I would say. This stars Daniel Kaluuya as Fred Hampton, the number 2 in command of the Black Panthers in the Chicago organization. Lakeith Stanfield is Bill O'Neill. He's the crook that becomes the informant. Jesse Plemons plays Roy Mitchell, the FBI lead on this informant. Dominic Fishback plays Deborah Johnson, who becomes the love interest of Fred Hampton. So the story starts with this small-time crook. It's really funny. He is stealing cars by pretending to be an FBI informant and then arrests all the crew and then steals their car. But unfortunately, he steals the car, barely makes it out, and he gets about a half block. The police pull him over, they arrest him, they find out he's stealing cars, so he's going to jail for that. And then also he has an FBI, he's pretending to be an FBI agent, so obviously that's a huge no-no. So he's looking at maybe 5, 6, 10 years of his life going down the toilet if he goes to prison. But then he gets pulled aside by the FBI. It's like, hey, we can make this all go away, but you have to inform for us for the Black Panthers. He's like, that sounds like a good deal, right? So he gets involved, he works his way into kind of the beginning of the Black Panthers with Fred Hampton. And at first he's kind of a preliminary, out on the edges kind of character. And then he slowly he's like, hey, if you give me a car, I'll become the driver. And so then he becomes the driver, so he's much closer to Fred Hampton. And at that point, he starts to really ingratiate himself with the team. But at the same time, he almost gets exposed as this crook by this gang leader that the Black Panthers are meeting. He's like, oh shit, he almost gets called out. Luckily, sells his way out of that because they force him to steal a car to prove it. Or the hotwire car, so he proves that he has a real crook. So they're like, okay, maybe he's not a cop, he's a real crook, right? So they come very close to uncovering early on that he might be someone that he's not portraying to say he is. So that has a really nice element, I would say. And you just have this continuing ratcheting up of, you be a crook, and then he's like, can I get out? No, you gotta stay in. Okay, there's a shootout, you're gonna stay in. Fred goes to jail, and it's constantly ratcheting up the pressure until they take out Fred. So you have this really nice build-up in the story, I would say, of the build-up of the Black Panthers as the rise to power, and this guy quandary whether, to help Fred sell them out. One of the persons that gets ratted out by the Black Panthers gets tortured, supposedly, so he's freaked out. He's like, oh my god, I gotta get out, and they won't let him get out. And so they really build up the pressure, I would say, in that side of the story. It's also based on the real life story of this informant that was inside the Black Panthers, so you constantly have this kind of interspersed between the film of his interviews, why you were in, what you were doing, and all that. So that kind of pulls that film together. I like that element. You also have kind of this historical tale of how Fred Hampton grows the Black Panther bigger and bigger and bigger, and he's meeting different gang leaders and really trying to pull the city together. And if you've ever been in Chicago, I grew up around the suburbs. It's an extremely segregated area, especially downtown. The suburbs is a little more mixed, but you'd have an Hispanic neighborhood, a Black neighborhood, a Mexican neighborhood, a Polish neighborhood, Italian neighborhood, and really it's partially just because how it came about, but the political leadership also enforced a lot of the segregation in the city, which makes things even worse, I would say. I mean, people naturally move closer to their own communities, their own tribes, but the leaders kind of were behind that as well. They didn't really cover that aspect. I thought they could have done a little bit more as far as connecting the Democratic leadership is splintering these neighborhoods specifically into different regions, which kind of kept it more divided. One thing I think they missed out a little bit, they hinted about, obviously they were reading about Marxist and socialist ideals from Chairman Mao, obviously the Marxism from this USSR, but I don't know if they could have connected it a little bit better. You know, from what they're saying, they're just reading the books and then they're interpreting it and going with this militant solution, which is fine. Obviously Black Power is about that, but I think there was maybe a little bit of funding probably from the CCP, Russia, and they don't really talk about that. I mean, maybe that's just the story the FBI sold to us in the 90s when I was growing up, that, hey, they were funded by the CCP in Russia, they must be bad. So you always have this quandary, you know, was there involvement with the CCP and was there involvement with Russia? I think that would have been a good element to follow up, like where they were getting their books. Was it purely just an American inspired movement, or was it actually inspired by the communists, as the FBI kind of likes to sell the tale of the Black Panthers and why they were so dangerous? And if they'd used that angle a little bit more, it would have led to why the FBI thought the Black Panthers were so dangerous. I think they kind of covered that, but if they had made that connection a little stronger in the film, I think that would have said it. I mean, I understand it because I grew up in the Cold War, but if you grow up later, you may not know the story as well. If you're growing up as a millennial, you'll be like, what the hell are they talking about? I mean, you'll definitely lead your curiosity kind of see where it goes, but you know, if you're not a Black urban youth, then you may not know the connection with the story. So I think that would have led a little bit more with that connection between the suspicions of FBI, why the connections were to China, Russia, etc. So that they could have built a little bit more there. I think just they have a scene where they talk about Black Panthers being way worse than China or Russia, but if they had made that connection just with a few slides and showing, hey, we think the money's coming in here, we think this leader, they're getting books from there, just that little bit of more, that would have made, I think, the focus on the group better. Obviously, the FBI at this point is very strongly US focused and CIA is strictly external, non-US focused. So there's a split between the group. Obviously, we know in 9/11, they kind of brought those together a little bit because of the danger of what happened. Kind of 9/11 happened between the cracks of the CIA and the FBI not talking to each other, and you would have this obviously danger in that element where you'd have the FBI and CIA not talking to each other. So, you know, there may have been something there because the FBI would be focused on internal groups only. They have a lot of great use of historical costumes, historical buildings, historical cars. They use some blurry, I think, when they drive down the streets, so they probably would drive in the areas where they were actually at, but since they use a blurry effect in the background, maybe some of those shots aren't historical in the background and they're just using historical cars to keep the cost cheaper. But I think that's fine for me. It didn't, I don't miss that. I just noticed that as, kind of my editorial movie thing. I'm thinking, oh, that's blurred out probably because they didn't have the sets exactly perfect, but I can live with that. And also it's good to have that blurry effect so you focus more on the faces versus the background. Another thing I thought was interesting is this came out in the year right after, obviously the film finished and they were filming it right during the social unrest of 2020 with the COVID lockdowns and then people getting pissed about that and then it leading to frustrations about Black people killed by the police, which is very relevant to the Black Panthers. There's a lot of parallels there. And as well as the crazy far right that rose under Trump, he kind of turned a blind eye to it, so to say, or some people said he actually supported them. So it's kind of like wishy-washy there. And you had obviously the insurrection at the Capitol. You had months and months of BLM protests, months and months of Antifa starting fires in Portland, Seattle. So you have these two great splinter groups, you could say militant groups within the US, and news has only covered one. They've only covered the Trump protesters, which obviously the attack on the Capitol was horrible, but they kind of excused the attacks on Antifa, and you're like, man, it's such a propaganda even today in our movement. So it's very interesting to see how the news portrays these two groups. Nowadays it's kind of flipped the coin. Back in the 60s it would have been the black militants and the far right KKK they would have covered, but not as drastically, even though the KKK in the 60s would have been much stronger than they are today, I would say. So it's very interesting. You can see how the news filters those stories. And so there's a lot of parallels to today's and it was great that they made the story during that time frame in 2019, 2020. Probably they're more editing 2020, but that feel of the element really probably helped that film, I think, really sell the film. You also have kind of a little bit, the marketing I think was a bit off because they kind of sold it generically, I would say, as kind of a Black Power against the police kind of movement. So then instantly I thought it was going to be a BLM movement. I thought it was a propaganda film so that they would beat Trump in the election. I don't know. But I think if they had made it a little bit more obvious with the Black Panther logo in the film, marketing, you would have got like, oh, this is about the Black Panthers, because I totally would have wanted to see it more as a Black Panther. I went and saw it anyway because I was like, okay, this will be still interesting. I thought it was going to be very inflammatory because of marketing. They use kind of the really punchy scenes of Fred Hampton discussing revolutionary tactics. So you're like, oh man, this must be about BLM. It must be like, let's overthrow the government. You're like, oh my God, what the hell is this? While they doing this right after the election where you had the Capitol protests and you had the BLM movement and you had the Antifa destruction, you're like, oh wow, these guys don't screw around. So I thought like, oh, that's a little bit of rocky ground to kind of sell a movie into. If you sell it more into a peaceful era, it's probably more viewable in the sense that people have time to process and got away and distance from the reaction once you're in the moment of revolution, which, 2020 felt a little bit like that because of these, drastic lockdowns and people being, the psychological damage that has done, and then just blew up with these protests on either the right or the left. It created a great environment for this film to produce it, I think, but it makes it challenging to market, I think, because I totally understood it as going to be a BLM film versus a Black Panther film. Another part is this is a tragedy, so it's a very hard sell for audiences. It's always proven people like to go to a silly, goofy, maybe say a Kevin Hart film, maybe a rock film or something like that, where it's just kind of easy-hearted, fun, kind of escapism. And this is like the real historical tale, the real drama, and the real tragedy of the Black Panthers kind of being overly revolutionary, so they drew too much attention and led to their downfall in a way by the police being overreacting to what they were saying. But the Black Panthers were saying they were going to revolutionize the government, overthrow the government. So groups like that, they say what they say, eventually it's going to do what they do. So, from the FBI standpoint, you can see the FBI, why they drew the attention, took the Black Panthers very seriously, were very afraid of them catching on as a movement. So, yeah, and you had this really nice contrast of the Black Panthers talking about revolution and anti-police, anti-violence, and overthrowing the system. So people were like freaking out. People that weren't in those communities are like, oh my God, what are these Black Panthers? And at the same time, you have the Black Panthers are making soup kitchens, they're educating kids, they're babysitting those kids after school and after school programs. So really connecting with the community, but at the same time, the danger of uprising for other communities outside of the poor area. So it's kind of like a really interesting dynamic. They have a little bit of, how the Black Panthers became kind of a serious group for the US government and the fear mongering, basically them standing proud and lean, but also taking a way more militant viewpoint. I would say maybe not more militant than Nation Islam, but very on the edge of that. One thing I would have said, so you really get a feel of why the Black Panthers and the police reacted the way they did to the Black Panthers. Unfortunately, the police have been very militant in this area, and even now and today, we can see with the protests with BLM, it's still unfortunately an existing cause to this day. I grew up in Chicago, and I saw the way the police reacted with Black communities versus white communities are very different. I rode in a car with my Black friends, and they wouldn't even wear their hat. They said, "Take off your hat, man. They might think we're gang members." And I'm like, dude, we're riding a car, but it's like 4 Black guys and 1 white guy. They're just gonna think we're a gang member. So it's like, okay, man, it's just a completely different reaction. You walk with your white friends, you're never gonna think of taking off your baseball cap. So the reaction there is very different in the police in Chicago, and that still remained in the 90s, which is literally 30 years after this film takes place. So you can only imagine how much more drastic and reactive the police were in the 60s. Another interesting thing is they talk about a little bit of the Black Panthers, how people went from, say, the NAACP or Martin Luther King, which is more pacifist movements and slow reform, versus the more militant versions of Malcolm X or the militant groups of Black Panthers. So you have a little bit of that contrast of why different people in the community, the Black community, went one way or they went the other way, or how they transitioned from this pacifist to the more militant version. And so that's a really interesting mix. I think the only thing I would have liked to have seen, I think, would have been a little bit of the rivalry between the Panthers and Nation of Islam, because they both were canvassing in these major cities, Chicago, LA, New York, some of these really major Black cities, and there would have been, hey, go to religion and join Islam. This other one was Black Panthers, let's overthrow the government. So they are basically talking a very similar message, but they would have been competing for the same communities, and they wouldn't have been cool. The Nation of Islam would have been cool if you're in the Panthers and vice versa. They're very parallel, so they wouldn't have been that different, but I think there would have been a little bit of rivalry, which they could have exposed a little bit in the film. They talk about You know, they show Fred Hampton reading about like the autobiography of Malcolm X on the bed. So you kind of get that feel like they're on the same parallel. But, you know, they didn't talk about the rivalry, and I think there would have been a rivalry there. I think they could have discussed them a little bit more. They had this really interesting parallel too of kind of the FBI. He's kind of seen as a neutral guy, or he thinks he's a neutral guy, and he's doing the greater good of the society. So they really get kind of this good old country boy kind of look that he's kind of like this neutral guy, but obviously he's doing well in the FBI. So he has this nice middle class background, but at the same time he's following the FBI, and the FBI is this paranoid culture of the Black Panthers are going to destroy the world, which, you know, from the FBI standpoint, they're policed at the national level, so they would have taken the Panthers very seriously, and they did historically. So you have the kind of that nice power structure, and at one point they ask, what would you do when your daughter grows up and she might date a black guy? And so you got to this paranoid connection between, especially in the 60s, but even nowadays it's a lot less so, but even when I was growing up, it was still a thing in the city. Like, I had a black girlfriend, and I was afraid to tell my white friends I had a black girlfriend. She had the same thing. She didn't want to tell her dad, and so you had this real challenge between different groups. Like, do you really go forward and say, hey, we're an interracial couple? I did know one interracial couple in my neighborhood, and this was in the 90s, so imagine back in the 60s how this would have been portrayed, and that idea of people, the fear of the mixing of the races was much more stronger back in the day, and especially way back when, you know, the 20s, 30s, you know, close to slavery times. The slavery time, they would have just been considered slaves, and, you know, as a way to create more slaves, especially once they cut off the slave trade. Obviously, they don't talk about that in this film, but you have that historical thing of, you know, if once you mix, then they're considered black. You mix and you consider black. And so this weird dichotomy where you could be 90% white, but you have some black blood, and then you're considered black, which is totally preposterous. If you look at other cultures like, say, Brazil, or other American communities, you've kind of had this mixing of races, and there's broader bands of what's considered, you know, black versus, say, the pure European white history. So you have more of that blend, but in the American history, it's kind of like black, 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 a little whiter, 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 and then suddenly straight white. So you had this weird blend of, you know, how it's seen in American culture within the US versus, say, Brazil or something, where you might have a different strata of Indian races, Indian mixed with white, you might have black, and then a black mixed with white, and then you have the white group. So it's much more of a strata of the racism versus in the US, where it was kind of a white-black kind of thing. And you still see it in our forms today, where you check the block if you're white, you check the block if you're black, you check the block if you're Latino. And you have this weird splitting up of people into these different labels, where if you're, say, Latino, you could be black-white, you could be black Indian, you could be Indian-white. And so it's like, really, how descriptive is it to say Latino versus white, black, Indian? You know, it's like these labels are so kind of arbitrary in a way. But yeah, I think they covered some of those issues really well. And, you know, overall, it's a pretty good historical film. I think they covered what they could cover. You know, very minimal changes. I would have had maybe a little bit of Nation of Islam rivalry there, maybe a little bit, but not necessary to the telling of this tale. They did cover it pretty well, the paranoia of the FBI and the Panthers. But yeah, overall, I think it's a really strong film, very interesting. They could have done a little bit better, but, you know, it's hard to improve a historical film like this because they're trying to be true to the nature of the story while telling it in a sellable Hollywood format. So that's always a challenge with an historical tale. I think that's probably why they chose this one. It would be interesting as well to see Huey, which was the original founder of the Black Panthers, his story and how they had a shootout in LA. That would be interesting to tell as well. Or I think there was another Black Panther that escaped to Africa, so it would have been really interesting to tell his story as well, to see all those different elements. But yeah, I think this was a really good story. I recommend it. If you guys would like, you can subscribe to my channel below. And hope to see you in the next movie review. Thanks for watching, guys.